Tonight, we're going to travel through one of the most fascinating and forgotten stories of humanity. We'll meet two peoples who changed the world, each in their own way, and discover what happened when these forces met in the frozen lands of the north. It's a journey through infinite steppes, stormy seas, and battles that redefined the map of Europe and Asia. It's worth staying until the end because the story of this encounter between Mongols and Vikings reveals something surprising about courage, strategy, and the limits of human power. So get comfortable, turn off the lights if you want, and let's go. The steppes that change the world. Imagine a horizon that never ends. A vastness of golden grass that moves with the wind like waves of a green ocean. It's the end of the 12th century, and in the steppes of Mongolia, under a sky so vast it seems to swallow the entire world, one of the most transformative forces in human history is born. The air there is different. Dry, cutting, with the smell of earth and something wild we can't quite define. During the day, the sun burns mercilessly. At night, temperatures plummet and the cold penetrates your bones. It's a place that doesn't forgive weakness, and maybe that's exactly why the peoples born there became so resilient, so adaptable. The Mongol tribes lived in a world of constant movement. Their homes were felt tents called gurs, which could be dismantled and reassembled in a matter of hours. There were no cities, no walls. Life was nomadic, following herds of horses, sheep, and yaks through the seasons. The sound of the wind was constant, sometimes soft as a whisper, other times roaring like a furious beast. But don't think this life was simple or primitive, on the contrary. The Mongols developed an incredibly sophisticated society, perfectly adapted to their environment. They knew the stars better than many navigators. They could read the signs of nature, predict the weather, find water where there seemed to be nothing. And above all, they were masters of something that would change the course of history, the art of mounted warfare. From childhood, Mongols learned to ride. At 3 or 4 years old, they were already on a horse. By 10, they were skilled archers, capable of hitting a target while galloping at high speed. The Mongol composite bow was a marvel of engineering for its time, capable of launching arrows at impressive distances with devastating force. Have you ever thought about what it means to grow up in a place like that, where each day is a matter of survival, where nature gives no quarter, where your skill determines whether you'll eat or go hungry? At the end of the 12th century, these tribes were divided, often at war with each other. Alliances formed and dissolved like the clouds that crossed that infinite sky. But something was about to change. Among these tribes, a young man named Temujin was growing up. He had seen his father poisoned, his family abandoned by the tribe, had known hunger, humiliation, the most brutal struggle for survival. But Temujin had something special, a vision. An ability to unite people, to inspire loyalty, to see beyond ancient tribal divisions. He started small, gathering allies, warriors who believed in him. And gradually, tribe by tribe, he unified the Mongols. In 1206, something extraordinary happened. The Mongol tribes, for the first time in history, united under a single banner. And Temujin received a new name, Genghis Khan. The universal Khan, the leader of all Mongols. Imagine the scene. Thousands of warriors gathered on the steppes, their white tents dotting the landscape like stars fallen to earth. The sound of horses, the smell of leather and sweat, the crackling of 1,000 fires under a starry sky. And at the center of it all, a man with a vision that went far beyond those plains. Genghis Khan wasn't satisfied just uniting the tribes. He saw the world beyond the steppes. He saw the rich empires to the south and west. And he had a revolutionary idea for his time, to create an empire based not on birth, but on merit. An empire where loyalty and skill mattered more than lineage. It's curious how these ideas still resonate today, isn't it? The notion that talent should be recognized regardless of origin, that competence matters more than surname. If you're enjoying our stories, subscribe to the channel to help our community grow and receive notifications of new stories. Comment where you're watching from and what time it is. It's fascinating for us to know where our community is around the world. But what made the Mongols so effective wasn't just Genghis Khan's leadership. It was an entire system he created, a communication system through fast messengers who could cross vast distances in days. An army organized into units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 men, where each one knew exactly their role. A meritocracy where any soldier, no matter how humble, could rise to the highest positions if they proved their worth. And there was something more. The Mongols were pragmatic. Unlike many conquerors of the time, they didn't try to impose their culture or religion on conquered peoples. They wanted control, trade, tribute. But they let people live their lives, practice their beliefs. Engineers, artisans, merchants were valued and protected. Only those who resisted faced the full weight of the Mongol war machine. The strategy was simple and terrifying. Cities that surrendered would be spared. Cities that resisted, well, they served as examples for the next ones. The world was about to change. The steppes that seemed so distant, so irrelevant to the great empires of the time, were generating a storm. And this storm was about to sweep from China to the Middle East, from Persia to the gates of Europe. But there's a fascinating detail in this story. While the Mongols were preparing to conquer the known world on the other side of the continent, another warrior people was shaping its own destiny. In the cold lands of the north, where ice and sea meet, the descendants of the Vikings were building something different, but equally impressive. And what happened when these two forces met? Well, that's a story few people know. A story of culture clash, of completely different war strategies, of an encounter that, in a way, marked the limits of the greatest land expansion in history. The most efficient machine in history. So what made the Mongol army so special? Why did entire empires with enormous walls, numerous armies, and centuries of military tradition fall before these warriors of the steppes? The answer isn't just in bravery or ferocity. It's in something much more fascinating: organization, innovation, and a deep understanding of something we now call psychological warfare. Let's start with the heart of Mongol power, the horse. Not just any horse, but the small, hardy horses of the steppes. Imagine an animal that seems almost insignificant compared to the large European war horses. Smaller, stockier, with hard hooves and thick coats. But these animals were true marvels of endurance. A Mongol horse could travel about 80 miles per day, day after day, with little food and water. It could survive grazing where other horses would starve. And most importantly, each Mongol warrior didn't take just one horse into battle. They took 3, 4, sometimes 5 extra horses. While riding one, the others followed alongside, resting. This meant a Mongol army could move with a speed that seemed impossible to their enemies. 200 miles in a week? Easy. 300, if necessary. While traditional armies advanced heavily with their supply wagons, their heavy armor, their tired horses, the Mongols danced across the battlefield like the wind. The sound of a Mongol army on the move was unique. The thunder of thousands of hooves, the creak of leather, the soft clinking of arrows in quivers, but not the metallic weight of European or Chinese armies. The Mongols didn't wear full metal armor. They preferred layers of hardened leather, sometimes reinforced with metal plates, light enough to allow rapid movement. And then there was the bow. that composite bow made of layers of wood, horn and sinew, glued with resin and wrapped in birch bark to protect from moisture. It was a masterpiece that took more than a year to make and another year to dry and cure properly. Have you ever tried to shoot an arrow while running? Now imagine doing it while galloping at full speed, turning backward, hitting targets 70, 80 meters away. The Mongols did this in their sleep, or rather, they did it awake, but it was as natural to them as walking is to us. But the real genius was in the organization. Genghis Khan created a decimal system that was simple and brutally efficient. Each unit of 10 men, called an arban, had a leader. 10 arbans formed a jargon of 100 men, 10 jargons formed a minghan of 1,000 men, and 10 minghans formed a tumen of 10,000 warriors. The beauty of this system? Each leader personally knew the men under their command. They weren't just numbers, they were comrades, sometimes relatives, always people you trusted with your life. And responsibility was collective. If one man fled from battle, his entire unit of 10 would be punished. This created a loyalty and discipline that few armies in history have managed to match. It's interesting to think about that, isn't it? How structure, organization, can make all the difference. Doesn't matter how brave an individual warrior is if there's no coordination, communication, a system that works. Communication on the battlefield was done through flags, drums, and signal archers who fired arrows with different colors. In a chaos of thousands of men and horses, Mongol commanders could coordinate complex movements, flanking maneuvers, feigned retreats, simultaneous attacks from multiple directions. Ah, yes, feigned retreats. This was one of the Mongols' favorite tactics, and it trapped countless armies. It works like this. The Mongols attack, fight for a while, and then seem to panic and flee. The enemy, excited by the victory, breaks their formation and pursues. And then, when they're disorganized, tired, far from their defenses, the Mongols turn and attack for real, with fresh forces that were hidden, waiting, devastating, elegant, in a certain macabre way. And there was military intelligence. Before attacking a region, the Mongols sent spies, merchants, travelers who mapped the territory, studied the defenses, identified political divisions that could be exploited. They knew exactly what they were facing before they even arrived. When they finally attacked, they used psychological warfare masterfully. Stories of completely destroyed cities spread faster than the army itself. Terror traveled ahead of them like an invisible wave. And this was deliberate, because a city that surrendered without fighting was much more useful than a pile of rubble. They always offered a choice: surrender and live under Mongol protection, paying tribute but keeping your culture, your religion, your way of life. Or resist and face terrible consequences. Most cities chose the first option, and who can blame them? The Mongols were also masters at adopting technology. Conquered China? Great, let's take their siege engineers, their catapults, their gunpowder weapons. Defeated the Persians? Excellent, their administrators and bureaucrats are welcome. There was no foolish pride about doing things the Mongol way. If something worked, it was incorporated. Imagine the sound of a Mongol siege. The creaking of enormous catapults built by Chinese engineers, launching stones that flew through the air like solid thunder. The whistling of incendiary arrows, thousands of them darkening the sky like clouds of fire locusts. The rumbling of the first gunpowder weapons, new and terrifying to those who had never seen them. But whenever possible, they avoided long sieges. They preferred speed, mobility, intimidation, divide the enemy, attack their supply lines, force them to fight in the open field, where Mongol cavalry had all the advantages. And you, what do you think about this? Leave your thoughts in the comments when you have a moment. Logistics were also impressive. Each Mongol warrior carried everything they needed: bow, arrows, at least 60, lance, lasso, rope, tools to repair equipment, leather canteen for water, dried meat, dried cheese that could last months. They didn't need long supply columns. They could live off the land and in difficult times even drink a little blood from their horses without killing them. This independence meant they could operate in territories where other armies would simply starve. The Russian steppes in winter? The Mongols were at home. The deserts of Persia? Challenging, but nothing they couldn't overcome. And they had an advantage few realize: clear motivation. They didn't fight just for a distant king or an abstract cause. They fought for wealth, for land for their herds, for an empire that promised them stability and prosperity. Genghis Khan instituted a system where conquered wealth was divided relatively fairly. Even the humblest soldier received their share. Isn't that why so many joined voluntarily? Why entire tribes chose to ally with the Mongols instead of resisting? Because they saw opportunity, not just threat. Of course, not everything was perfect. The life of a Mongol warrior was hard, constant training from childhood, campaigns that lasted years away from home, the constant risk of death or injury. But for many, especially those in smaller tribes or decaying empires, the Mongols offered something tempting: meritocracy, order, a system that rewarded skill. At the beginning of the 13th century, this military machine was sharpened and ready. Genghis Khan looked at the map of the known world and saw opportunity in all directions. To the south, the Jin dynasty of northern China, rich but divided. To the west, the Khwarezm Empire, prosperous but arrogant. To the east, they already controlled most of Mongolia. And to the north, well, the north would be a different story. But first, they would conquer empires that seemed invincible. Cities that had existed for 1,000 years would fall in weeks. Dynasties would be erased. And the world map would be redrawn by riders of the steppes, whom most civilized people considered barbarians. Funny how history has these ironies, isn't it? The barbarians created the largest contiguous land empire in history. They established trade routes that connected east and west in unprecedented ways. Pax Mongolica, they called it later. The Mongol Peace, a time when it was possible to travel from Korea to Hungary under a single law relatively safely, with communication and trade flowing. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Before the peace would come the storm. And what a storm! When millennial empires fell. So, with this military machine sharpened and ready, the Mongols began their expansion. And what happened next changed the world map in a way we still feel today. Let's talk about three empires that seemed eternal, solid as mountains. Each with its own history, its culture, its strength. And each one that found in the Mongols something they couldn't overcome. First, the Jin dynasty. Imagine northern China at the beginning of the 13th century. Enormous walled cities with millions of inhabitants, palaces with jade-green roofs shining in the sun, markets where you could find silk finer than mist, porcelain so delicate it seemed like flower petals, spices from places so distant they seemed like legends. The Jin dynasty had ruled northern China for almost a century. They were descendants of the Jurchen people, warriors who had conquered the territory from the Chinese Song. They had numerous armies, walls that extended for hundreds of miles, a military tradition that went back generations, but they had a problem. They were becoming complacent. The Jin elites had adopted the Chinese lifestyle with all its sophistication and luxury. And with luxury came a certain softness. Generals preferred court politics to military campaigns. Soldiers were often forced recruits who didn't want to be there. When Genghis Khan sent ambassadors demanding submission in 1211, the Jin emperor made a fatal mistake. He humiliated them. Perhaps he thought those nomads from the steppes were just another troublesome tribe that could be ignored or easily defeated. He discovered otherwise very quickly. The Mongol invasion of Jin China was a lesson in strategy. They didn't try to besiege all the major cities at once. They attacked rural areas first, destroying crops, taking villages, cutting supply lines. The great cities, however fortified, depended on the countryside for food. And there was something more. The Mongols were masters at exploiting divisions. Many Han Chinese under Jin rule weren't particularly loyal to their Eurasian conquerors. Some even allied with the Mongols, seeing them as liberators. Ironic, isn't it? The siege of the great Jin cities was something from another world. The Mongols, who came from the open steppes, quickly learned the art of siege warfare. With the help of Chinese defector engineers, they built giant catapults, siege towers, used primitive explosives. The sky over cities like Zhongdu, future Beijing, darkened with smoke and dust, but even so, some cities resisted for months, even years. Human determination is impressive, isn't it? Even facing the impossible, many chose to fight. The final fall of the Jin dynasty took more than 20 years. It wasn't a quick conquest. It was a slow process of erosion, of accumulated losses, of territory that shrank year after year. In 1234, the dynasty that had ruled for more than a century simply ceased to exist. Think about the number of lives that changed, millions of people who woke up one day under one banner and went to bed under another. Cultures that mixed, traditions that were lost or transformed. Now let's go west, to the Khwarezm Empire. If you've never heard of it, don't feel bad. Few have. But in the early 13th century, it was one of the richest and most powerful empires in the world. It stretched from Iran to Afghanistan, from the Caspian Sea to the edges of India. It controlled the Silk Road, that ancient network of trade routes connecting east and west. Cities like Samarkand, Bukhara, Urgench were centers of trade, learning, art. Libraries that held centuries of knowledge. Bazaars where the smell of spices mixed with perfumes, where merchants negotiated in dozens of different languages. Shah Muhammad II, ruler of Khwarezm, was powerful and knew it. He had an army of 400,000 men, according to some sources. His territories were vast, his cities well defended. Genghis Khan, pragmatic as always, tried to establish trade relations. He sent a caravan of Mongol merchants in 1218 with gifts and trade proposals. But the governor of a border city, Otrar, decided they were spies. He ordered them executed and their goods confiscated. Genghis Khan sent ambassadors demanding justice. The Shah, in a moment of catastrophic pride, had one of the ambassadors executed and the others humiliated, shaving their beards and sending them back. You can almost feel the silence that must have fallen when this news reached Genghis Khan. Among the Mongols, ambassadors were sacred. Killing them was the greatest imaginable offense. What followed was one of the most devastating campaigns in history. The Mongols crossed mountains that seemed impassable, attacked from directions the Shah considered impossible. They divided their armies into columns that moved independently, surrounding cities from multiple directions at once. And you, what do you think about this? Leave your thoughts in the comments when you have a moment. The Khwarezm Empire, so powerful on paper, collapsed with shocking speed. Part of the problem was the Shah himself. He didn't trust his generals, was afraid of giving them armies that were too large. So he dispersed his forces, leaving garrisons in multiple cities instead of concentrating power to face the Mongols in decisive battle. The Mongols defeated these isolated forces one by one. Cities that resisted faced terrible sieges. Those that surrendered quickly were spared the worst. But the Shah? He fled. He abandoned his empire and spent his last days being pursued through Persia until he died, sick and alone, on an island in the Caspian Sea. His son, Jalal ad-Din, was made of harder material. He fought bravely, gathered armies, even achieved some victories, but he was fighting against the tide. Eventually, he was forced to retreat, to flee, to watch his world crumble. In just 2 years, from 1219 to 1221, an empire that had taken decades to build was completely transformed. Cities with centuries of history changed hands, dynasties ended, trade routes were interrupted and then reorganized under new management. It's hard to even imagine the scale of this transformation, isn't it? What would it be like to wake up in a world you know and, in a few years, see everything changed? And then there's Kiev and Rus, the lands we now know as Ukraine, Western Russia, Belarus. In 1200, they were a mosaic of principalities, each with its own prince, its own ambitions. Kiev had been the most important city, but now its power was divided among several centers: Novgorod in the north, Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast, Halych in the southwest. These were lands of deep forests and wide rivers. In winter, everything froze under a blanket of snow that seemed eternal. The smell of pines, the silence that only snow brings, the crackling of ice on the rivers. The East Slavs who lived there were traders, farmers, warriors when necessary. They had heard rumors about the Mongols, stories that seemed exaggerated. But in 1223, these rumors became reality when a Mongol reconnaissance army appeared on the southern steppes. The Russian princes, for the first time in a long time, united. They gathered an army and marched to face this unknown threat. They met at the Battle of the Kalka River in May 1223. It was a disaster. The Mongols used their usual tactics: feigned retreats, attacks from multiple directions, overwhelming speed. The Russians, unaccustomed to this type of warfare, were decisively defeated. Several princes died, others fled, but then the Mongols simply left. They returned east. And the Russians, relieved, tried to forget the nightmare. It would be a mistake, because the Mongols hadn't finished. They were just taking notes, learning, planning. 15 years later, in 1237, they returned. But this time, it wasn't a reconnaissance army. It was the main force, led by Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan. And this time, they came to stay. What happened next is known as the Mongol invasion of Rus. During 1237-1240, city after city fell. Ryazan, Vladimir, Suzdal, Moscow, still a small city at that time, and finally, in 1240, Kiev itself. Kiev, the mother of Russian cities, with its golden churches and its 1,000 years of history. It resisted for weeks, but eventually the walls were broken. The city was taken, its treasures plundered, its population dispersed. And here's something fascinating. The Mongol conquest of Rus changed the course of Russian history in ways we still feel today. The principalities under Mongol rule developed different political systems from those that remained independent. Russian autocracy, some historians argue, has roots in this period. The very word for money in Russian, dengi, comes from the Mongol tenge. How can an invasion of a few years reverberate for centuries? How can a violent encounter between cultures shape nations that didn't even exist yet? What did these three empires have in common? They all underestimated the Mongols, they all relied too much on their traditional defenses, and they all discovered that the world had changed, that a new form of warfare had arrived, and they weren't prepared. But there's something more in this story. Something about adaptation, about how civilizations respond to existential challenges. Some places never recovered, others transformed and eventually prospered under new leadership. And some found ways to resist that the Mongols didn't expect, because while the Mongols seemed unstoppable, marching from the Pacific to the gates of Europe, there were places where their expansion would begin to find limits. Dense forests where cavalry didn't work as well, mountainous terrain that denied their speed advantages. and peoples who had their own war traditions, their own forms of resistance. In the north, in the lands of ice and sea, something was waiting. It wasn't an empire in the traditional sense. It didn't have China's population or Persia's wealth, but it had something more: maritime tradition, intimate knowledge of difficult terrain, and a particular stubbornness that comes from surviving in places where nature itself tries to kill you. The lords of sea and ice. And now let's go to the other side of the world. To lands where the sun in summer barely sets, and in winter almost never rises. Places where the sea is a road as important as any land path. Where ice shaped not just the landscape, but also the people. When we talk about Vikings, most think of the fierce warriors of the 8th to 11th centuries, the raiders who terrorized Europe, who sailed to North America centuries before Columbus, who established kingdoms from Scandinavia to Sicily. And all of that is true, but in 1240 the era of classic Vikings had ended more than a century before. The Nordic world had changed, transformed, evolved into something different, but no less fascinating. Imagine Scandinavia in the 13th century. 3 kingdoms are taking shape: Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. They're no longer just collections of tribal chiefs fighting among themselves. They're monarchies in formation, with written laws, stone churches, trading cities. Christianity replaced the old Norse gods, at least officially. Thor and Odin still echoed in the stories told during the long winter nights. But now people prayed in churches dedicated to Christian saints. But some things hadn't changed. The Norse were still unmatched sailors. Their vessels evolved from war-long ships to more robust merchant nurs, but knowledge of the sea remained fundamental. From childhood, a Norseman learned to read the ocean like others read books. The color of the water, the movement of the waves, the behavior of seabirds, everything told a story. The smell of the sea. Salt mixed with fish, with seaweed, with something indefinable that only the ocean has. The sound of waves against the wooden hull, the creak of ropes, the snap of the sail in the wind. And always, always, the cold. Even in summer, the wind from the north brings with it the memory of ice. Nordic houses were long structures of wood and turf, built to keep warmth during brutal winters. Inside, by the light of the central fire, you'd find families weaving, cooking, telling stories. The smell of wood smoke, of simmering stew, of wet wool drying. Walls decorated with tapestries, tools hanging, weapons that reminded of a not-so-distant past. In the 13th century, Norway was perhaps the most expansionist of the Nordic kingdoms. It controlled not just Western Scandinavia, but also the Orkney and Shetland Islands, the Hebrides, parts of Ireland, Iceland, Greenland. A maritime empire spread across thousands of miles of stormy ocean. Sweden, on the other hand, was looking east, to the lands we now know as Finland, the Baltic coasts and beyond, to Slavic territories. The Swedes, or Ruts as they were called in the east, had a long history of trade and sometimes conquest in these regions. And here's where our story begins to converge. Because while the Mongols pushed north and west, conquering the Russian steppes, establishing dominion over Slavic principalities, they inevitably approached the Nordic spheres of influence. But before we get there, we need to understand something fundamental about the 13th century Norse. They weren't just warriors, they were traders, explorers, colonizers. They had established a trade network that went from the Arctic to Constantinople, from Dublin to Novgorod. This city would be crucial to our story. Located in northwestern Russia, it was one of the few important Russian cities that maintained significant independence during the Mongol period. And why? Because it was too far north, in lands of swamps and dense forests where Mongol cavalry had difficulty. and because it had strong connections with the Nordic world, especially with Sweden. Have you ever thought about how geography shapes history? How a swamp or forest can be as effective as an army in determining the fate of nations? 13th century Nordic society had its own hierarchy. At the top, kings and jarls, earls, lords of land and sea. Below them, the carls, free men who could be farmers, merchants, artisans. And at the base, the thralls, servants who did the heaviest work. But even this structure was more fluid than in many places in Europe. A clever and brave man could rise, a fool could fall. Laws were taken seriously. The thing, the assembly where free men gathered to decide legal and political matters, was a tradition that went back centuries. It wasn't democracy as we know it today, but it had elements of participation that many empires of the time didn't have. And they had something more, a tradition of exploration that seemed insatiable. The Norse had reached Greenland, established colonies that survived in one of the most hostile environments imaginable. They had even tried to colonize Vinland, what is now Canada, although these attempts didn't last. Imagine the courage required. Putting your family on a wooden ship and sailing west into the North Atlantic, not knowing if there's land on the other side, if you'll encounter ice, storms, sea monsters, as some believed. And even when you found land, you faced winters where the sun didn't rise for months, where a mistake could mean your entire community dying of hunger or freezing. This shapes a people. It creates a hardness, a self-sufficiency, but also an impressive capacity for adaptation. The Norse survived where others would have perished. Stay with me until the end, because what comes next is a fascinating part of this journey. Nordic warfare in the 13th century was different from the classic Viking era. Less lightning raids, more organized campaigns, larger, more structured armies, but they still maintained certain characteristics. Nordic warriors were formidable in close combat. The Nordic war axe, in skilled hands, could split shields and armor. The spear was ubiquitous, used for both throwing and hand-to-hand combat. But perhaps their greatest advantage was versatility. They could fight on land, but were equally lethal at sea. They could build fortifications, besiege cities, navigate rivers on deep inland raids. And they knew winter. While many armies paralyzed when snow fell, the Norse just switched to skis. Yes, skis. Skiing wasn't a sport, it was transportation. It was survival. It was military tactics. Warriors on skis could cross snowy landscapes with surprising speed, attack from unexpected directions, disappear into white forests like ghosts, and they mastered warfare on ice. Battles fought on frozen lakes, on rivers, transformed into solid bridges by winter. Imagine the sound of that. The muffled silence of snow broken by the war cry, the clash of weapons, and beneath it all, the threatening creak of ice under the feet of hundreds of men. There was something else that defined the Norse. Fierce pride. A refusal to bow easily. Stories of ancestors who had conquered kingdoms, sailed unknown seas, defied empires. This wasn't just mythology, it was identity. It was who they were. And here's something fascinating. While the rest of Europe was becoming more feudal, more stratified, the Norse maintained this tradition that a man should be able to look another man in the eye, king or not. Respect had to be earned, not just inherited. Don't we see echoes of this today in Scandinavian societies? This idea of fundamental equality, that birth shouldn't completely determine your destiny. At the beginning of the 13th century, these Nordic kingdoms were consolidating, but also looking outward. Sweden was particularly interested in the lands around the Baltic, not just for conquest, but for trade, for influence, for territorial expansion. And there was an additional motivation: religion. The Catholic Church was encouraging crusades in the Baltic, converting the remaining pagans, Prussians, Lithuanians, Estonians, Finns, by the sword if necessary. The Swedes participated in these campaigns with varying enthusiasm, mixing religious fervor with territorial ambition. It was in this context that the Norse began to involve themselves more deeply in the lands that are now Finland and the eastern Baltic coasts, establishing forts, founding cities, extending trade routes. And that's how, inevitably, their sphere of influence began to overlap with something coming from the east. Stories began to arrive of a people coming from the steppes, horsemen who had conquered unimaginable lands, who now controlled the trade routes going south to Byzantium and beyond. The Norse had faced many enemies over the centuries. Franks, Anglo-Saxons, each other. They had seen battles, conquered lands, lost territories, but they had always been the ones coming from the unknown, they who were the unpredictable force. Now something was coming their direction, something different from everything they had faced before, a war machine forged in the steppes, tested on some of the world's greatest civilizations. And when these two warrior cultures met, when the descendants of the Vikings looked across a frozen field and saw the descendants of Genghis Khan looking back, something remarkable happened. Something that defied expectations, something that would show that even history's greatest war machine had limits. And sometimes those limits weren't just geographic, but cultural, tactical, a matter of being on the right terrain, with the right skills, at the right time. When the empire looked north. So we're in the mid-13th century. The Mongol Empire stretched in a way that seemed impossible just a few decades before. From Korea to Poland, from southern Siberia to the Persian Gulf. It was the largest contiguous land empire the world had ever seen. And it was still growing, but every empire, no matter how large, eventually finds borders. Some are physical, impassable mountains or vast oceans. Others are more subtle, matters of logistics, of climate, of terrain, that denies the advantages that made you invincible elsewhere. After the death of Genghis Khan in 1227, the empire was divided among his sons and grandsons, but remained unified under the leadership of a great Khan. Ugadai, Genghis's third son, assumed this role, and under his leadership, expansion continued. To the west, Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, was in charge of conquering European lands. And he took this task seriously. During the 1230s, his armies swept through the Russian steppes, conquered the principalities of Rutsi, and then continued west. The European campaign of 1241-1242 was terrifying for those in its path. Poland was invaded, Hungary was devastated. European armies that tried to stop the Mongols were decisively defeated. At the Battle of Legnica in Poland, heavily armored knights were destroyed by Mongol mobility and tactics. At the Battle of Mohi in Hungary, an entire Hungarian army was practically annihilated. Europe was in panic. It seemed nothing could stop this wave from the east. Kings wrote desperate letters to each other, asking for help, trying to form alliances. The Pope declared a crusade against the Mongols, but few responded, distracted by their own wars and intrigues. And then the Mongols simply stopped. They turned and went back east. News had arrived that Ugadai Khan had died, and by Mongol law, all important princes had to return to Mongolia to elect a new great Khan. Europe breathed. Many saw this as divine intervention. The reality was more mundane, but the result was the same. The immediate threat had passed, but this didn't mean the Mongols had gone away. Batu Khan established his own Khanate, the Golden Horde, in the steppes, north of the Black Sea and the Caspian Sea. Its capital, Sarai, would become one of the richest cities in the world, a commercial center where merchants from dozens of cultures met. And from here, from what is now southern Russia and Kazakhstan, Batu and his successors would rule over a vast territory. The Russian principalities became vassals, paying tribute, providing troops when requested. It wasn't direct occupation in most places. The Mongols were pragmatic. As long as tribute was paid and supreme authority recognized, they allowed local princes to continue ruling. Imagine life under this system. You're a Russian prince in Vladimir or Moscow. Your city is yours, your people are yours, but above you is the power of the Khan. Periodically, Mongol envoys arrive, counting heads, assessing wealth, collecting what is due. And if you think of resisting, well, there are enough examples of cities that tried and were reduced to ashes. It's a life of constant compromise, of careful navigation between maintaining your identity, protecting your people, and not provoking the wrath of an empire that has repeatedly demonstrated that resistance has a terrible price. But there were places where Mongol control was weaker. The farther north you went, the harder it became for steppe cavalry to operate. The dense forests of pines and birches that covered northern Russia weren't like the open steppes. Here, the mobility that made the Mongols invincible was limited, and the winters. Oh, the winters. The Mongols knew cold, of course. The steppes in winter are brutal. But northern Russia was something different. The snow that falls and doesn't melt for months. The cold that turns your breath into ice crystals. Nights that last almost the entire day, when the sun barely appears on the horizon before disappearing again. Stay with me until the end, because what comes next is a fascinating part of this journey. Novgorod, in the northwest, maintained greater independence than other Russian cities. Not because it was militarily stronger, but because it was too far away, in terrain too difficult to be worth the effort of total conquest, and because it was more useful as a vassal paying tribute than as a smoking ruin. But being a vassal of the Mongols wasn't Novgorod's only concern. The city had another threat coming from a different direction, the west. The Swedes, the Danes, the Teutonic Knights, all with their eyes on the lands around the Baltic. The Catholic Church saw these lands as frontier, places where Orthodox Christianity, practiced by the Russians, and paganism, practiced by many Baltics and Finns, needed to be replaced by Catholicism. And there was, of course, the additional bonus of territorial conquest and control of lucrative trade routes. It was in this complicated context that one of the most interesting figures in Russian history emerged, Alexander Nevsky. Prince of Novgorod, he faced an impossible dilemma: threats from the west and pressure from the east. How do you protect your people, your city, your culture, when the world seems to be closing in from all sides? In 1240, the Swedes invaded, sailing up the Neva River with considerable force. Their objective was clear: establish control over northern trade routes and expand Catholic influence. Alexander gathered his forces and attacked quickly. The Battle of the Neva was a decisive victory for the Russians. Alexander earned his nickname Nevsky from that day. But he barely had time to celebrate. 2 years later, in 1242, a new threat, the Teutonic Knights, a crusading military order, invaded from the west. They took fortresses, threatened Novgorod directly, and it was here that something happened that would enter history and legend: the Battle on the Ice, also known as the Battle of Lake Peipus. April 1242. Lake Peipus, on the border between what is now Russia and Estonia, was still frozen. A vast expanse of ice, covered here and there with snow, reflecting the pale light of a Nordic sun. Alexander Nevsky had studied his enemy. The Teutonic Knights fought in heavy formation, an impenetrable pig's wedge of knights in full armor. It was a tactic that had worked countless times, crushing enemy formations through sheer weight and momentum. But Alexander had a plan. He positioned his troops on the ice, appearing weaker than he was, inviting attack. The knights, confident, charged, their combined weight, men in heavy armor and horses all hammering the ice. And then Alexander attacked from the flanks with his lighter, more mobile forces. Archers rained arrows, infantry attacked from the sides, and the ice, stressed by the weight of so many heavily armored warriors, began to break. The sound must have been terrifying. The cracking of ice, loud as thunder, the shouts of men, the neighing of horses, and the icy water of the lake below, waiting. How many knights died drowning, pulled down by the weight of their own armor? Sources vary. Some say hundreds, others less. But the result was clear. The Teutonic knights were defeated, their invasion was repelled, and Novgorod was safe, at least for now. It's interesting to think about Alexander Nevsky. Here was a man who defeated invaders from the west with tactical brilliance. And yet when it came to the Mongols in the east, he chose diplomacy and submission. He personally traveled to Sarai and then even to Karakorum, the Mongol capital in Mongolia, to pay homage and secure Novgorod's position. His contemporaries criticized him. Some called him a coward, a traitor, but wasn't he simply being pragmatic, recognizing that some battles can't be won by force, that sometimes survival requires compromise? Russian history eventually canonized him, Saint Alexander Nevsky, the hero who saved Russia. And perhaps he did save it, not through suicidal resistance, but through careful navigation of an impossible world. But back to the Mongols. During the following decades, they consolidated their control over the steppes and areas to the south. Trade flourished under the Pax Mongolica. Merchants could travel from China to Europe with relative safety. Ideas, technologies, even diseases, the Black Death, would come later via Mongol trade routes, flowed freely. However, the farther north the Mongols tried to extend their influence, the harder it became. The forests, the swamps, the ice. They were barriers not just physical, but tactical. Their cavalry, so dominant on the steppes and open fields, struggled here. And the peoples of the north knew their lands. They knew where the ice was too thin, where the swamps hid secret paths, where the forests offered ambush. They fought in different ways, using the terrain as an ally. There were skirmishes, of course, small clashes on the borders, Mongol patrols that ventured too far north and never returned, Nordic raids into Mongol-controlled territories, but a direct, large-scale confrontation? That was rarer. Until at some point, probably not long before or after 1240, the spheres of influence collided in a way that couldn't be ignored. The exact details are nebulous, lost in the mists of history. We don't have detailed accounts like we have of other Mongol battles, but we know enough to reconstruct what probably happened. A Mongol force, perhaps exploring the possibilities of northern expansion, perhaps pursuing some specific objective, entered territories where Nordic influence was strong and encountered resistance. Not the organized armies of established empires, but something possibly more dangerous. Warriors who knew every tree, every frozen stream, every trail through the endless forest, who could appear from nowhere, attack, and disappear like smoke, who used winter as a weapon as effectively as any bow or spear. For the Mongols, accustomed to the vast steppes where they could see the enemy miles away, where their mobility was supreme, this was a nightmare. How do you fight an enemy who refuses to face you in open field? Who attacks your supply column and disappears before you can react? Who waits on the ice, knowing every crack, every weak point? And perhaps for the first time, the Mongols encountered a people who weren't impressed by their stories of conquest. The Norse had their own stories, their own legendary ancestors, and they had survived for centuries in places that would make anyone else give up. What happened in that frozen encounter, in that moment where two of history's most formidable warrior cultures faced each other? That's the story few people know. A story not of a battle, but of a different kind of victory. The victory of simply not being conquered. Worlds separated by more than distance. To really understand what happened when Mongols and Norse met, we need to understand the worlds that created them. Because they weren't just different peoples. They were products of geographies so contrasting they almost seem from different planets. Let's start with the steppes. Close your eyes and imagine. A horizon that extends as far as the eye can see without any obstacles. Golden grass swaying in the wind, undulating like an endless ocean. The sky so vast and blue, it seems to have infinite depth. White clouds that dance slowly, casting shadows that race across the land like living creatures. In summer, the heat is oppressive. The sun beats down directly with no trees to offer shade. The smell is of dry earth, of heated grass, of distance. The wind is constant, carrying sounds from far away. The whinny of a horse, the call of an eagle, the whisper of the earth itself. At night, the temperature drops dramatically. The sky transforms into a carpet of stars, so dense you could get lost in it. The Milky Way isn't a pale strip, but a brilliant river of light crossing the cosmos. And the silence. A silence so profound you can hear your own heart beating. In winter, the steppes transform. Snow covers everything, creating a white vastness that hurts the eyes. The wind is no longer a whisper, but a fierce howl that cuts through any clothing, penetrating to the bones. Temperatures can drop to 20–30 degrees below zero or more. Any mistake, any carelessness can be fatal. This environment offers no hiding places. You can see an enemy coming from miles away. There are no forests for ambushes, few mountains for defense. Survival depends on mobility, on knowing every water source, every pasture, every change in the seasons. And the Mongols became masters of this environment. Their horses, small but tireless, could graze where there was almost nothing. Their gers could be assembled and disassembled in hours, allowing constant movement. They learned to travel light, to carry only the essentials, to find resources where others would see only emptiness. The steppe teaches certain lessons. It teaches that you're always exposed, always visible, that speed is survival, that you must move with the seasons or die, that the horizon is both friend and enemy, showing opportunities but also dangers long before they arrive. Now let's go to the other extreme, to the northern lands, the lands of the Norse. Here, the world is vertical. Forests of pines and birches rise like living cathedrals, their trunks disappearing into the darkness above. Sunlight, when it manages to penetrate, creates golden rays through the mist, illuminating the green moss that covers everything like a soft carpet. The smell is completely different. Pine and resin, damp earth and decomposing leaves, mushrooms growing on fallen logs. It's a smell of life and death mixed, of constant growth, of permanent moisture. The sounds are also unique. The whisper of wind through trees different from the wind of open steppes. The distant call of a raven, the creaking of branches, the constant dripping of water. And in lakes and rivers, the soft sound of waves, the crackling of ice, the sudden dive of a fish. In summer, these lands explode with life. Days that seem to have no end when the sun barely sets before rising again. Wildflowers cover clearings, berries ripen on trees, the air swarms with insects. It's a time of frantic growth, as if the earth knows that winter is always waiting, and what a winter! When the cold arrives, it's not just a matter of temperature, it's a complete transformation. Snow covers everything with meters of depth. Lakes and rivers freeze so solid you can cross them on foot, on horseback, even with loaded sleds. The world goes silent, muffled by snow, as if sleeping. But it's a dangerous sleep. The cold here is humid, penetrating. It enters through any opening, any weakness in your clothing. And the darkness. At the height of winter, the sun may appear for only a few hours, a weak and pale light that barely warms before disappearing again. In this environment, survival requires completely different skills from the steppes. Here, you can't see far. An enemy could be 10 meters away and you wouldn't know. The forests offer infinite hiding, but also infinite confusion. It's easy to get lost, go in circles, end up where you started. The Norse learned to read these environments in ways that seem almost magical. They knew how to use moss on trees for navigation, the stars when visible, the patterns of snow and ice. They built houses that kept warmth through the most brutal winters. They navigated stormy seas using the sun, the stars, even the behavior of whales, and the sea. Oh, the sea. For the Norse, the sea wasn't a barrier, it was a road. Their vessels were masterpieces of design, capable of crossing open oceans or navigating shallow rivers. The sea offered food, offered transportation, offered adventure and danger in equal measure. Can you see how these different geographies would create different cultures, how the vast open steppes would favor mobile horsemen, while the forests and seas of the north would favor sailors and ambush warriors? Now imagine the clash when these worlds met. Mongols, accustomed to seeing everything, to riding free, to using space and speed as weapons, arriving in lands of dense forests where you can't see 10 meters ahead, where their horses stumble on roots and sink in hidden swamps, where the enemy could be anywhere, behind any tree. And the Norse, accustomed to vertical and fragmented terrain, to fighting in small groups through forest and mountain. Confronting an enemy that came from open plains, that fought in formations of thousands, coordinated with military precision that few Europeans had seen. Geography shapes strategy. On the steppes, the key is mobility and vision. You need to move fast, see far, use space to flank and envelop. In the northern forests, the key is local knowledge and adaptability. You need to know every trail, every hidden passage, use terrain for ambush and defense. And there's winter. Both peoples knew cold, but they were different types of cold. The dry cold of the steppes versus the humid cold of the north. The snow that winds sweeps across plains versus the deep snow that accumulates in forests. Ice on open lakes versus ice on winding rivers through broken terrain. The Mongols were supreme in open terrain in winter. They could use frozen lakes as roads, cross rivers that would normally be barriers. Many of their victories in Russia happened in winter when other armies withdrew, waiting for spring. But in the deep forests of the north, where winter meant not just cold but almost total darkness, where accumulated snow made movement difficult even for those who knew the terrain, that was different. And the Norse had centuries of experience surviving, even thriving in these conditions. Think about logistics too. A Mongol army moved with herds of horses, ate meat and dairy, needed pastures. On the steppes and even in the plains of central Russia, this worked. But in dense forests where there are no adequate pastures, where you can't move large herds, where forage has to be brought or hunted, it's fascinating how geography imposes limits even on the greatest empires, isn't it? How mountains, forests, seas can be defenders as effective as any army. And there was another crucial difference: water. On the steppes, water is precious, sources are known and controlled. But in the north, water is everywhere. Countless lakes, rivers running in all directions, constant rain in summer, snow melting in spring. And where there's water, there's ability to resist sieges, to sustain populations, even when cut off from external trade. The Mongols were masters at controlling trade routes and water sources on the steppes. That's how they exercised power. But in the fragmented north, where each region had its own resources, where coastal cities could be supplied by sea, where forest villages could live on hunting and fishing, control was much harder. And then there's the question of perception. For the Mongols, wealth meant herds, pastures, control of trade routes. The north offered fewer of these things. Yes, there was valuable trade in furs, amber, forest products. But it wasn't like the Silk Road, not concentrated in points that could be easily controlled. Did this make the north less attractive for total conquest? More effort, less immediate reward compared to the rich empires to the south and west? These contrasting geographies also shaped the psychologies of the peoples. The Mongols, living under that immense sky, developed an expansive vision, a sense that the world was theirs to take. The Norse, surviving in fragmented and unforgiving environments, developed a local stubbornness, a deep sense that their land, however harsh, was theirs. When sandstorms swept the steppes, the Mongols simply moved, found another place. When snowstorms buried the Norse dug in, built stronger, resisted. Two different types of resilience, and both were impressive in their own way. The Mongols created the largest land empire in history by adapting to multiple environments. The Norse created a maritime civilization that touched 3 continents while maintaining their essential identity. But in that moment in the mid-13th century, when these two forces met on the margins of their respective worlds, in the transition lands between steppe and forest, between Mongol control and Nordic influence, something had to give. And what happened wasn't what many would expect. It wasn't a quick and total conquest like the Mongols had done elsewhere. But it also wasn't a clear victory for the Norse. It was something more subtle, more interesting, a mutual recognition that some places, some peoples, some terrains simply aren't worth the cost of total conquest. The forests and ice would keep their secrets a little longer. Warriors from opposite worlds. Now that we understand the worlds that shape these peoples, let's talk about how they fought. Because the way a culture makes war reveals a lot about who they are, what they value, how they see the world. Mongol warfare was, above all, a matter of system. It wasn't chaos, it wasn't uncontrolled fury. It was brutal mathematics applied to the battlefield. Imagine a Mongol army preparing to attack. Even before they arrive, they already know everything about the enemy. Spies disguised as merchants, as refugees, as pilgrims, have already mapped every city, every fort, every army. They know the numbers, the defenses, the political divisions. They know where to strike for maximum impact. When they finally appear, they don't come from one direction, they come from 3, 4, 5 directions simultaneously. Forces that seem to be hundreds of miles away suddenly converge with clockwork precision. The enemy finds itself surrounded before even realizing the war has begun. The battle itself is a deadly dance. Mongol horsemen circle at a safe distance, raining arrows. Not random arrows, but coordinated volleys concentrated on weak points in enemy formations. The sound would be deafening. The whistle of thousands of arrows cutting through the air, the impact against shields, the cry of the wounded. And if the enemy tries to charge, the Mongols simply retreat. Their horses are faster, fresher, because they constantly switch mounts. They lure the enemy away from their defenses, tire them out, and when the formation begins to fall apart, the Mongols attack for real. Not with a frontal charge like European knights, but from all sides at once, enveloping, cutting, isolating small units that can be destroyed one by one. It's like watching a wolf hunt, patient and lethal. And they had signals for everything. Different colored flags meant different commands. A specific drum beat ordered a formation change. Signal arrows traced arcs in the sky, coordinating units separated by miles. In the chaos of battle, the Mongols maintained order, communication, purpose. Discipline was absolute. If a commander ordered retreat, everyone withdrew, even if they were winning. Because maybe that retreat was part of a larger trap. Trust in the system, in hierarchy, was total, and this made them predictable to themselves but unpredictable to enemies who didn't understand this level of coordination. In sieges, they were equally systematic. They didn't attack walls thoughtlessly. They studied, planned, built. Engineers, often captives from previous conquests, built siege machines, catapults, towers, battering rams. They diverted rivers to flood cities or cut off water supplies. They always offered surrender before the final assault because an intact city was more valuable, but if the city refused, the destruction would be methodical and complete, not from gratuitous cruelty, but as an example. See what happens when you resist. It was terror as a strategic tool. Think about the efficiency of this. An empire built not just on strength, but on information, coordination, calculated fear. It's almost modern in its approach, isn't it? Now let's go to the other side, to Nordic warfare. The Norse fought in a completely different way. It wasn't about formations of thousands coordinated by complex signals. It was about small groups of warriors, often bound by family ties or oaths, fighting with personal ferocity. A Nordic warrior wasn't just a soldier in an army. They were an individual with reputation, with personal honor to defend. Stories of ancestors weighed on their shoulders. Courage wasn't just valuable, it was essential to identity. Equipment was different too. While Mongols preferred lightness and mobility, Norse valued protection and impact power. A well-equipped Nordic warrior would wear chainmail, a helmet, some decorated with crests or intimidating designs, a round shield of reinforced wood, and the weapons. Ah, the weapons. Nordic swords were treasures passed from father to son, often with their own names. Icebiter, Bone Eater, names that carried stories of past battles. War axes with broad blades and long handles, capable of splitting shields and armor. Spears that could be thrown or used in tight formation. But perhaps the Norse's true weapon was knowledge of terrain. They didn't fight on open plains if they could avoid it. They used forests, mountains, rivers. They knew every trail, every passage, every place where an ambush would be perfect. Imagine a Mongol column advancing cautiously through a dense forest. The trees are so close together you can barely see the sky. The ground is covered with dead leaves that muffle sounds. Suddenly the silence is broken by war cries. Warriors emerge from behind trees, from hidden ravines. There aren't thousands, maybe just dozens, but in this tight terrain, larger numbers don't matter as much. Combat is brutal and close. Axes against shields, swords seeking openings. There's no room for elaborate tactics. It's strength against strength, skill against skill. And then as quickly as they appeared, the Norse disappear into the forest, taking some Mongol horses, leaving confusion and dead. How do you fight against that? How do you apply your step tactics when you can't see the enemy until it's on top of you? If you're enjoying this journey, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next stories. And there was the sea. The Norse were fundamentally a maritime people. They could attack by water, landing where and when they wanted. Their ships were fast and could navigate surprisingly shallow rivers. A Mongol force trying to control a coastal area would face a problem with no easy solution. How do you defend an entire coast against enemies who can appear anywhere? How do you chase ships when your strength is in horses? The Mongols were adaptable, yes. Eventually, they would build fleets, try to invade Japan, twice, both disastrously. But it wasn't their natural strength. It was like forcing a specialist in something to do their opposite. And then there was the cultural question of war itself. For the Mongols, war was business. Cruel, yes, but business. The goal was conquest, control, tribute. Useless resistance was punished, submission was rewarded. It was rational. For the Norse, war had a different dimension. Yes, there were practical objectives, lands, riches, trade, but there was also honor, reputation, the idea that how you fought mattered as much as the result. A warrior who died bravely earned a place in Valhalla, or at least so their pagan ancestors believed. Even with Christianization, this warrior ethic remained. This didn't make them more or less effective, just different. A Mongol would see retreating from a losing battle as sensible. A Norseman might see it as dishonorable, preferring to die fighting. Who's right? Depends on what you value more, survival or reputation. There were also differences in scale. The Mongols thought in terms of empires. Campaigns that lasted years, conquering territories the size of continents. The Norse thought more locally. Raids, small wars between chiefs, control of specific regions. Yes, they had built larger kingdoms, but the mentality was still more fragmented. It's interesting to think how these differences would manifest in a direct confrontation. Mongol discipline against Nordic ferocity, mass coordination against individual skill, open steppe tactics against dense forest knowledge. In open field, the Mongols would have overwhelming advantage. Their mobility, their mounted archers, their tactics tested against the greatest armies in the world. It wouldn't even be fair, but in broken terrain, forests, mountains, swamps, suddenly the advantage disappears. Mongol horses, so effective on plains, stumble on roots, sink in mud. Bows, which need space for movement, are less useful between tight trees, and the enemy knows every rock, every tree, every secret trail, and in the extreme winter of the north, when the sun barely appears, when snow is so deep that movement is torture. The Mongols were tough, yes, but the Norse had lived their entire lives preparing for these winters. They knew how to make skis, sleds, clothes that actually worked. They knew where to find food when everything seemed dead. It wasn't that the Norse were better warriors, person by person. The Mongols had proven their worth against practically everyone. But there was something about the combination of difficult terrain, brutal climate, and enemies who simply refused to fight the way you wanted. And maybe, deep down, there was mutual recognition. The Mongols, who respected courage and skill, seeing in the Norse worthy warriors. The Norse, who had their own stories of conquest, recognizing in the Mongols an unprecedented force, not brotherhood, not friendship, but perhaps an understanding that some confrontations aren't worth the cost, that some places resist not by being stronger, but by being different in ways that deny your advantages. The northern forests weren't impressed by stories of fallen empires. The ice didn't care about tactics that worked on the Persian steppes, and the men and women who lived there had survived worse things than armies. Sometimes the greatest victory is simply not losing, not being conquered, not bowing, maintaining your identity, your land, your way of life, even when the world around you is changing in impossible ways. And maybe, just maybe, both sides understood this. On the margins of their respective spheres of influence, where forest meets steppe, where Mongol control bumps against Nordic stubbornness, a balance was found. Not peace, exactly, but not total war either. A recognition of limits. Something that history's greatest empire eventually had to accept. The inevitable encounter. So, we arrive at the moment where all these forces converge, where the steppes meet the forests, where the most powerful empire in history encounters lands that resist in ways no stone fortress ever could. We're somewhere around 1240. The world is changing rapidly. In China, the Mongols continue their slow conquest of the Song dynasty in the south. In Persia, the Ilkhanate is establishing itself. And in Eastern Europe, Batu Khan's Golden Horde has consolidated as the dominant power on the steppes. The Russian principalities pay tribute. Moscow, still small, Vladimir, Kiev, devastated but rebuilding, all recognize Mongol supremacy. Princes travel to Sarai to receive investiture, to resolve disputes, to demonstrate loyalty. It's a system that works for the Mongols: indirect control, low costs, constant tribute. But to the north, the situation is different. Novgorod maintains its peculiar independence. It pays tribute, yes, but it's too far away, in terrain too difficult for direct control. And its connections with the West, especially with the Swedes and Hanseatic merchants, give it alternatives. And beyond Novgorod, even farther north and west, there are territories that don't even recognize Mongol authority. Lands around the Baltic, the coasts of Finland, the Swedish archipelagos. Here, Nordic influence is strong. Swedish forts dot the coast. Merchants sail routes that connect these places to the rest of Scandinavia. For the Mongols, accustomed to controlling vast territories, these areas represent an anomaly. Not exactly hostile, but not submissive. Mongol merchants who try to reach these regions sometimes disappear. Messengers don't return. It's as if there's an invisible line beyond which Mongol power simply doesn't extend anymore. Imagine the frustration. You've conquered China, Persia, Russia, defeated armies that considered themselves invincible. And then there are these forests in the north, these frozen lakes, these people in ships who simply refuse to recognize your authority. It's not that they're a significant military threat. The Norse won't invade the steppes, won't challenge the Mongol Empire directly, but it's a question of completeness, of principle, of establishing that Mongol authority is absolute within its claimed sphere. And then there's the practical aspect. These northern lands control valuable trade routes: Arctic furs, Baltic amber, timber, salted fish, products that have markets throughout the empire. The Mongols aren't just conquerors, they're traders. They want access, they want control, they want their share. Around 1240, it seems, a decision was made, perhaps by Batu Khan, perhaps by one of his generals, perhaps simply as a result of gradual escalation. A force would be sent north, not the main army, but a substantial force nonetheless. Thousands of horsemen, veterans of the Russian campaigns. The objective? Historical sources are nebulous, perhaps to establish more direct control over Novgorod, perhaps to explore possibilities of expansion beyond the Baltic, perhaps simply to show force, to demonstrate that even the far north wasn't beyond Mongol reach. The force advances in winter. This alone is impressive. Most medieval armies simply didn't operate in winter. Too cold, too difficult, too dangerous. But the Mongols had made their greatest conquests in winter. Frozen lakes became bridges. Rivers that blocked passage in summer were roads of ice in winter. Defenses that depended on water obstacles were suddenly vulnerable. Imagine the scene. Columns of Mongol horsemen advancing through white landscapes, the muffled sound of hooves on packed snow, the breath of horses forming clouds of steam in the freezing air. Warriors wrapped in layers of furs, faces protected against the cutting wind that sweeps across the open plains. By day, the sun, when visible, reflects off the snow blindingly. At night, the cold intensifies and fires are lit, points of orange light in a white and blue vastness. Food is prepared, horses are cared for, guards are posted. It's routine, something they've done hundreds of times. But as they advance north, the terrain changes. The open plains of the Russian steppes gradually give way to more broken terrain. Hills appear. Forests emerge on the horizon, first sparse, then denser. Frozen lakes and rivers become more numerous. And something else changes, the feeling. On the steppes, there's a clarity, an openness. You can see danger coming, but here, on the forest margins, there's a sense of being watched. that something is waiting beyond that line of trees. It's probably not just a feeling, because news of a Mongol army advancing north wouldn't go unnoticed. Hunters would see the columns and withdraw to warn their villages. Merchants would spread the word. And in Novgorod, in Swedish forts along the Baltic, in communities scattered through the forests, people would begin to prepare. Curious, isn't it? Leave in the comments what you think about this. Alexander Nevsky, having already faced Swedes and Teutonic knights, was no stranger to war, and he had something many commanders didn't: experience fighting in Nordic terrain against enemies equipped with Nordic mentality. He knew how to use terrain, how to turn numerical disadvantages into tactical advantages. But facing the Mongols was different. These were warriors who had destroyed armies much larger than anything Novgorod could muster, who had tactics tested against the best military forces in the world, who had never, as far as anyone knew, been truly defeated in open field. Direct confrontation would be suicide. Defend Novgorod under siege? The Mongols had taken much more fortified cities. Flee? Abandon his land, his people, his responsibility? There were no good options, only less bad ones. And perhaps Alexander thought of something other commanders didn't realize. The Mongols were invincible on their terms. But what if you refused to fight on their terms? What if, instead of meeting them in open field, you lured them to your terrain, to places where horses sink, where bows have limited use, where local knowledge is worth more than numbers? The northern forests aren't like forests elsewhere. They're vast, dense, easy to get lost in. Frozen lakes are numerous, some safe to cross, others mortally treacherous. And at the height of winter, with the sun appearing for only a few hours, even knowing the way doesn't guarantee safety. And then there were allies, not formal armies, but local hunters, Finnish tribes, maybe even Swedes, who saw Mongol expansion as a threat. People who knew every trail, every passage, every place where an ambush would be lethal. The Mongol force was venturing into unknown territory. They knew it, but they had confidence born of hundreds of victories, adaptability proven in dozens of different environments, and the absolute belief that in the end, their tactical superiority would prevail. It's curious, isn't it, how confidence can be both strength and weakness, how past success can blind you to new and different dangers. The exact accounts of what happened next are fragmentary. We don't have detailed chronicles like we have of other Mongol battles, perhaps because it happened in a remote place, far from chroniclers, perhaps because the Mongols didn't like recording defeats, even small ones, perhaps because, for the Russians, it was just another skirmish in turbulent times, but we can reconstruct. We know there were confrontations. We know a Mongol force advanced into territories around Novgorod and beyond, and we know that eventually it withdrew. Not destroyed, but having accomplished little. What happened between the advance and the withdrawal? That's the fascinating part. The part that involves ice breaking under the weight of heavy horsemen, ambushes on forest trails, night attacks on Mongol camps, supply lines cut by raiders who disappeared like ghosts. Imagine being a Mongol warrior, veteran of campaigns in China and Persia, accustomed to vast plains where you could see the enemy and maneuver freely. And now you're in a forest where you can barely see 10 meters ahead, where the ground is covered with snow so deep the horses struggle to move, where arrows come from invisible directions, and when you try to pursue, the enemy simply disappears among the trees, and the cold. Not the dry cold of the steppes, but the humid cold of the north that penetrates through any clothing, that turns fingers and toes into numb pieces of flesh. Fires for warmth are invitations for attacks. Movement through deep snow exhausts men and horses, and supply, always crucial, becomes a nightmare when every wagon is a target for ambush. It wasn't one great epic battle. It wasn't Mohi or Legnica, where armies met in open field and Mongol genius prevailed. It was something more frustrating, a campaign of 1,000 small problems, patrols that didn't return, supplies that never arrived, advances that encountered not armies to defeat, but empty forests and abandoned villages. And when they finally encountered resistance, it was of the most irritating kind. Small groups, well-positioned, using terrain perfectly. Inflicting casualties and disappearing before an organized response was possible. How do you defeat an enemy who refuses to be defeated on your terms? Eventually, the mathematics became clear. The cost of advancing in men, horses, supplies, morale was greater than any potential gain. The northern lands simply weren't worth this price. Not when there were easier and richer targets in other directions. And maybe, just maybe, there was a recognition that some peoples in some places with the right combination of terrain and determination simply couldn't be conquered in ways that made economic or strategic sense. The Mongol force withdrew, not in panic, not shattered, but withdrew. Returned to controlled territories, to the familiar steppes. And the northern border of Mongol influence was, tacitly, established. Not by treaty, but by practical understanding that beyond this point, cost exceeded benefit. Was it a victory? For the Norse and their allies, it certainly seemed so. For the Mongols, probably just a practical decision to reallocate resources to more promising campaigns. But the result was the same. The northern lands would remain outside direct Mongol control. And something else was established, a precedent. The idea that even the greatest empire had limits, that geography, climate, and the particular stubbornness of peoples defending their homes could be insurmountable obstacles. The battle nobody won. Now let's talk about what really happened in that frozen encounter. Not the mythological version, not the simplified story, but the complex and fascinating reality of when two worlds collided. First, we need to understand something important. There wasn't one single, decisive great battle. It wasn't like Mohi or Legnica, where armies met in open field, and the result was clear. It was something more fragmented, more frustrating, more interesting. Imagine several weeks, maybe months, of deep winter. The Mongol force advanced beyond Novgorod, entering increasingly difficult territories, perhaps seeking Swedish forts along the Baltic, perhaps trying to establish dominion over trade routes, perhaps simply exploring how far they could go. In the first days, it must have seemed like other campaigns. Yes, the terrain was different, but they were Mongols. They had conquered mountains in Afghanistan, deserts in Persia, the vast plains of China. Some forests and ice wouldn't be a problem, right? The first skirmishes were probably Mongol victories. Small groups of defenders, perhaps local militias or small detachments, trying to block passages through the forest. The Mongols, even in unfavorable terrain, were experienced warriors. They broke these defenses, continued advancing, but then things started getting strange. Patrols sent to explore routes simply didn't return. There was no battle, no bodies, or few, just absence. Men and horses disappearing into the White Forest as if they'd never existed. Supply lines began to be attacked, not by large forces but by small groups that emerged from nowhere, attacked a wagon or two, killed the guards, and disappeared before reinforcements arrived. It was like fighting ghosts. At night, Mongol camps were targets of lightning attacks. Arrows came from the darkness. Sometimes warriors emerged from nowhere, fought briefly on the edges of the camp, and then withdrew in the confusion. They didn't cause major casualties, but destroyed sleep, kept everyone in constant alert. The sound of a military camp under these conditions is peculiar. During the day there's normal activity, horses being fed, equipment being repaired, conversations. But at night, there's a tension in the air. Guards doubled. Every sound from the forest, every breaking branch, every distant howl makes hands reach for weapons, and the constant cold. Not the cold you can combat with adequate clothing and fires, the kind of cold that penetrates everything, that makes metal painful to touch, that turns breath itself into ice that forms on beards and eyebrows, that makes fingers go numb, making archers less effective, riders less skilled. The Mongols were tough, yes, but their horses raised on the steppes struggled in the deep snow of the northern forests. There were no adequate pastures, forage had to be carried or hunted, and hunting meant sending small groups into the forest where, well, we already know what happened to small groups. Curious, isn't it? Leave in the comments what you think about this. And then there were the lakes, the frozen lakes. Here's where the story gets really interesting, where reality and legend mix in fascinating ways. The Mongols had used frozen lakes brilliantly in Russia. They allowed rapid movement, negated water obstacles, transformed defensive geography into offensive advantage. So when they encountered the many lakes of the region, they must have seen opportunity. But there was a problem. The local Norse and Russians knew these lakes. They knew which froze solid, which had weak points, where underwater currents kept ice thin despite appearances. Knowledge passed from generation to generation, tested by centuries of winters. And there are stories, fragmented and difficult to verify, of confrontations on ice. Mongol forces trying to cross frozen lakes, being lured to areas where the ice was treacherous. Defenders who knew exactly where it was safe, using this as tactical advantage. Alexander Nevsky's battle on the ice against the Teutonic Knights in 1242 is well documented, but there are suggestions it wasn't the only time similar tactics were used. That ice, this element so characteristic of the North, became weapon, trap, battlefield, where local knowledge was worth more than numbers or military experience. Imagine the terror. You're crossing a frozen lake, hundreds of horsemen around you. The surface seems solid, white and uniform. And then you hear it. A cracking, low but unmistakable. The sound of ice beginning to give way, instant panic. Horses sense it first, start getting nervous. Men try to retreat, but hasty movement only makes it worse. And then the ice breaks, not all at once, but in sections, opening black cracks that reveal freezing water below. Water at 0 degrees or less isn't like normal water. It's shock to the system. It touches your skin and immediately starts stealing heat, triggers reflexes that can make you hyperventilate, inhale water. And if you're wearing armor, even leather armor, the extra weight pulls you down. Horses go into absolute panic. They're large, strong animals, but in freezing water, disoriented, fighting against currents under the ice, they drown quickly. And they take their riders with them. It doesn't need to be hundreds dying this way to be effective. Even a few dozen, drowned so horribly, create psychological trauma. Suddenly, every frozen lake becomes suspect. Movement becomes hesitant. And hesitation in military campaign is deadly in itself. And while the Mongols dealt with all these problems, where were the great defending forces? Where was the army they should defeat? The city they should besiege, the clear victory that would justify all this suffering? Nowhere. Or rather, everywhere. Local forces simply refused to concentrate at a point the Mongols could attack decisively. They kept dispersed, mobile, attacking opportunistically. It was a strategy that only worked in terrain that favored the defender, where mobility meant knowledge of secret trails through the forest, not fast horses in open field. The Mongols, masters of military intelligence, probably tried to infiltrate spies, capture informants, map the terrain. But in a hostile population, in unknown terrain, this is incredibly difficult. Information was scarce, unreliable, frequently deliberately false. And time passed. Weeks in brutal cold. Men beginning to suffer from frostbite, fingers and toes literally freezing, horses getting thin from lack of adequate forage, supplies draining without corresponding conquests, morale, normally iron, beginning to crack. Can you imagine the discussions among Mongol commanders, veterans of campaigns across Asia, accustomed to victories, now dealing with a situation that didn't fit any model they knew, continue advancing to where? In search of what? Or retreat and admit they'd found something they couldn't easily conquer. And there were probably larger confrontations too. Moments when significant forces met in forest clearings or at some defensible point. Fierce, brutal combat, the kind that leaves snow-stained red and bodies frozen in fighting positions. In these confrontations, the warrior quality of both sides must have shone. Mongols, even in unfavorable terrain, fighting with discipline and skill proven on dozens of battlefields. Norse and their allies defending homeland using every advantage of terrain, fighting with desperate ferocity. But even Mongol tactical victories didn't translate into strategic progress. You defeat a force, it disperses into the forest. You take a fort, it turns out to be just wood in a clearing, difficult to maintain, easy to bypass. You advance 10 kilometers and your supply line becomes 10 kilometers more vulnerable. It's war of attrition, but of a strange kind. Not a siege where you wait for the enemy to run out of food, but a situation where each passing day costs more than it's worth, where keeping the force in the field is harder than anything you can conquer. And there must have been a moment, perhaps after a particularly costly ambush, perhaps after a snowstorm that buried camps and killed dozens of horses, perhaps simply after weeks of accumulated small losses when the decision was made. Not worth it. Not now, not in these conditions. Maybe in summer, maybe with different preparation, maybe never. But now, retreating is the smart play, and the Mongols, pragmatic as always, retreated. Not in panic, not shattered, but in an organized manner, still dangerous, still capable of punishing anyone who pursued too closely. But retreating nonetheless. The withdrawal through hostile territory in winter must have been its own nightmare. Every step watched by invisible enemies, every camp potentially under attack. The temptation to pursue, to transform retreat into rout, must have been strong for the defenders, but Alexander Nevsky, if he was coordinating the defense, was too smart for that. Let them go, harass them in retreat, yes. Make sure they suffer enough not to want to return, yes. But don't risk everything on a big battle you might still lose. And eventually, the Mongol force left the deep forests, returned to the familiar plains, retreated to controlled territories, diminished, tired, but not destroyed. Having learned a valuable lesson about the limits of their power, was it defeat? By Mongol standards of total conquest and submission, yes. But it wasn't Einjalut, it wasn't annihilation. It was more a recognition that some places, some peoples, in some conditions, cost more than their worth. And for the defenders, it was victory. Not decisive, not final, but victory nonetheless. They proved the invincible empire had limits, that their land, however harsh, was theirs, that some borders aren't easily crossed. The forests returned to silence. Snow covered the marks of armies' passage, and life continued, as always in the north, harsh but free. Consequences and shifts of power. So what happened next? How did this frozen encounter, this battle that nobody really won, change the course of history? First, let's talk about the immediate impact. The Mongol force retreated, but the Mongol Empire didn't disappear. Far from it. The Golden Horde continued dominating the Russian steppes for more than 2 centuries. The Russian principalities continued paying tribute, navigating the complex world of Mongol politics. But something changed. A line was established not on maps but in practical reality. There was a limit to the north and west beyond which Mongol control was tenuous or non-existent. The deep northern lands, the dense forests, the Baltic coasts remained outside the sphere of direct dominion. This wasn't a formal agreement. The Mongols never officially acknowledged they couldn't conquer these lands, but in practice, their energies were directed elsewhere. To the south, to China, where the conquest of the Song dynasty would continue for decades. To the west, where smaller campaigns still happened. To consolidation of what they already controlled. And for the northern territories, they breathed. Novgorod maintained its peculiar position as a partially independent commercial republic, never totally free from Mongol power, but never totally subjugated. It was a delicate balance, maintained through skillful diplomacy, strategic payments of tribute, and the implicit knowledge that total conquest would cost more than it was worth. Alexander Nevsky became an even more important figure. His ability to navigate between two worlds, resisting invasions from the west while negotiating with Mongols from the east, was seen as essential skill for Russian survival. The Russian Orthodox Church eventually canonized him, transforming him from political prince to national saint. It's interesting to think about the complexity of his position, isn't it? Hero to some, collaborator to others, but perhaps simply a realist, doing what was necessary to protect his people in impossible times. The lands around the Baltic continued their own path. Sweden expanded its influence in Finland and on the eastern Baltic coasts. The Teutonic Knights, despite defeat at Lake Peipus, continued their Baltic crusades, eventually establishing their own state in Prussia. Denmark maintained control over parts of the southern Baltic, and a fascinating process began. The divergence between Russia under Mongol influence and the Nordic lands that remained outside it. Different political systems evolved. Cultures that had connections through trade and sometimes war began to diverge in ways that would have lasting consequences. In Russia, under Mongol rule, power centralized in new ways. Princes who wanted authority had to obtain it from Sarai, not just through local force or dynastic legitimacy. This created a politics where relationship with the Khan was crucial. Some historians argue that later Russian autocracy, the extreme concentration of power in the Tsar, has roots in this period. The Mongol tribute system also changed the Russian economy. Money became more important, trade was reorganized, certain routes were favored. And the Mongols themselves, with their vast trade network extending across Asia, connected Russia to distant markets in new ways. Meanwhile, in the Nordic and Baltic lands, different systems evolved. The Hanseatic League, a confederation of trading cities, became the dominant economic power in northern Europe. Novgorod was a member, connecting Russian trade to the vast Hanseatic system. Imagine the port of Novgorod in the late 13th century, ships from Lübeck, from Visby, from Bergen, bringing salt, herring, textiles, wine, taking furs, wax, honey, amber. German merchants with their own quarters in the city, negotiating in multiple languages. It's a crossroads, a meeting point between worlds that are politically increasingly separate but economically still connected. And there were military consequences too. The Mongols, having found limits to their expansion in the north, focused on other directions. The conquest of Song China was completed in 1279. Campaigns in Southeast Asia were attempted, and within the empire itself, politics became more complex, because the Mongol Empire was too vast to be governed as a single unit. It was already divided into semi-independent Khanates, the Golden Horde in Russia, the Ilkhanate in Persia, the Chagatai Khanate in Central Asia, and the Yuan dynasty in China. Nominally under a great Khan, but in practice increasingly autonomous, and these divisions would eventually lead to conflicts, Mongol civil wars, dynastic disputes, fragmentation of what had been the largest land empire in history. But that would come later. For now, at the end of the 13th century, the empire was still impressive, still commanded respect and fear. The story is coming to an end, but what comes next is the most reflective part. Stay with me. For the Norse, the encounter with the Mongols was also a lesson. They had seen what was possible in terms of military organization, of empire on continental scale. They didn't try to copy it. Their geography and culture didn't allow it. But the awareness was there. There were forces in the world beyond anything they had faced before. And this may have contributed to a certain caution, to focus on consolidation instead of aggressive expansion. The era of Viking raids had ended long ago. Now it was an era of established kingdoms, of regulated trade, of more conventional European politics. There were also subtle cultural consequences. Stories from the East, brought by merchants and travelers, began to influence Nordic narratives. Tales of distant empires, of steppe warriors, of lands beyond imagination entered folklore. And for Russia itself, the Mongol period, the Tatar yoke, as it was called later, became a fundamental part of national identity. Centuries of foreign domination, of tribute, of careful navigation between submission and resistance. Eventually, Moscow would emerge as the dominant power, growing under Mongol protection, learning lessons of centralization and control, before finally breaking free. The liberation process would take more than 2 centuries. Ivan III the Great finally ceased tribute payments in 1480. The Golden Horde, weakened by civil wars and the rise of new powers, could no longer impose its will. And Moscow, having learned well the lessons of its former masters, would begin its own expansion, eventually building an empire that would stretch from Europe to Asia. Isn't there something ironic about that? Russia, once subjugated by an empire of the steppes, becoming itself an empire that dominates the steppes, learning lessons of centralization, of control, of how to keep vast and diverse territories under single authority. The connections between Mongol domination and later characteristics of the Russian state are debated by historians. Some see a direct line of influence. Others argue that Russian autocracy has older roots, that Mongol impact is exaggerated. Probably, as with most historical things, the truth is somewhere in the middle. But one thing is clear: the encounter between Mongols and northern peoples in the 13th century was a decisive moment. Not because of the epic battle that didn't happen, but because of what it revealed about limits of power, about how geography and culture can be defenses as effective as walls, about how some borders are established not by treaties, but by practical reality. And perhaps something more was established: mutual respect. The Mongols, who respected courage and warrior skill, recognizing that the northern peoples were worthy adversaries. The Norse and Russians, recognizing the unprecedented power of the Mongol Empire, but also knowing they had resisted, that their lands remained theirs. It wasn't peace, it wasn't friendship, but it was balance, a recognition that some confrontations don't have clear winners, only practical accommodations. That the world is large enough for different spheres of influence, different forms of power. Trade routes continued. Goods flowed from east to west, from north to south. Ideas mixed, cultures influenced each other mutually, even as political systems diverged. And life, as always, found its way. On the steppes, the Mongols continued their traditions, eventually settling more, mixing with conquered peoples, transforming from nomadic empire into multiple more conventional states. In the northern forests, people continued their harsh but free lives, fishing, hunting, trading, surviving the cruel winters as they always had. And both worlds were changed by the encounter. Not dramatically, not immediately, but in ways that would reverberate through the centuries. The map of Eastern and Northern Europe was drawn in part by that moment when steppe riders encountered forests and ice and discovered that some places simply aren't easily conquered. The story of this encounter was forgotten by many. It didn't have the drama of other Mongol battles, didn't change dynasties overnight. but it was important nonetheless. As a lesson about limits, about the complexity of geography and culture, about how sometimes the greatest victory is simply not losing. Lasting legacies. So we arrive almost at the end of this journey through ice and history. But before we close, let's talk about something fascinating. How this forgotten encounter of 1240 left marks we can still see today, centuries later. Because history isn't just about what happened, it's about how those events shaped what came after, how they echoed through time, how they changed the course of civilizations in ways that people living in that moment could never have imagined. Let's start with something simple but profound: borders. The map of Eastern Europe we know today has roots in that period. The division between Central and Eastern Europe, between Western and Eastern spheres of influence, between cultures that look west and those that look in multiple directions. It wasn't just the Mongols who created these divisions, of course. Centuries of history, dozens of factors contributed. But that moment when the Mongol Empire established its northern limit, when certain lands fell under Mongol influence and others didn't, that mattered. Russia developed under 2 centuries of Mongol rule. Administrative systems, taxation practices, even words in the Russian language have roots in this period. The very concept of autocracy, of absolute centralized power, some argue, was reinforced by the experience of navigating Mongol politics where everything depended on the Khan's will. Meanwhile, the lands that remained outside direct Mongol control developed differently. The Hanseatic League created a decentralized commercial system, cities with great autonomy, traditions of mercantile law that would influence later capitalist development. The Scandinavian kingdoms evolved systems where royal power was balanced by assemblies, by traditions of consultation. It's fascinating to see how 2 lands, geographically close, culturally related in many aspects, diverged because of different historical experiences, isn't it? And there are military lessons. The encounter between Mongols and northern defenders demonstrated something important. There's no universally superior military strategy. What works brilliantly in one terrain can fail completely in another. Mongol cavalry, invincible on the steppes, found its limits in dense forests. Ambush tactics that worked perfectly in forests would be suicidal in open field. Modern militaries still study these principles: knowledge of terrain, adaptability, the importance of fighting on favorable terms. It's not about being the absolute best, but about understanding where your strengths are advantages and where they become weaknesses. And there's something deeper. The lesson about limits of power. The Mongol Empire, at the height of its strength, chose not to continue pushing north. Not from weakness, but from rational calculation. Recognizing that some territories simply aren't worth the cost of conquest and maintenance. How many empires since then have failed to learn this lesson? How many overextended themselves, trying to conquer territories that drain resources without adequate return? History is full of examples, from Alexander the Great in the mountains of Afghanistan, to the British facing tribal resistance in the same mountains centuries later, to the Soviets, and then Americans, encountering similar difficulties. Some places, some people, simply aren't easily conquered. And sometimes recognition of this fact is a sign of strength, not weakness. The story is coming to an end, but what comes next is the most reflective part. Stay with me. There are also subtle cultural legacies. The experience of resisting the Mongols, of maintaining identity and some autonomy, even under immense pressure, became part of the Russian national narrative. Alexander Nevsky isn't just a historical figure, he's a symbol. Symbol of intelligent navigation in impossible times, of choosing battles wisely, of protecting people through diplomacy when direct force would fail. For the Scandinavians and Baltic peoples, the experience was different, but equally formative. The awareness that there was power in the east, vast and dangerous, but that their lands, their forests, their knowledge of terrain offered protection. This reinforced an identity centered on territory, on local knowledge, on community that survives through cooperation and resilience. And there are economic legacies. The trade routes established during the Mongol period, connecting Asia and Europe, transformed global commerce. Spices, silk, porcelain flowing west, silver, furs, forest products going east. Novgorod, as a transfer point between Mongol and Hanseatic commercial systems, became incredibly wealthy. This commercial connection also led to cultural exchanges, technological ideas flowing through trade routes, gunpowder from China, eventually reaching Europe, techniques of metallurgy, of weaving, of architecture. Even diseases traveled these routes, like the devastating Black Death in the 14th century. It's a reminder that isolation is an illusion, that events in one part of the world inevitably affect other parts, sometimes in completely unexpected ways. The Mongol Empire, by connecting Asia and Europe more intimately than ever before, accelerated processes that were already happening, making the world smaller, more interconnected. Don't we see parallels today? Globalization isn't new, the scale is different, the speed is greater, but the fundamental connection of peoples and cultures through trade, through movement, through exchange of ideas, that's ancient. There are also lessons about resilience. The northern populations survived not by being militarily stronger, but by being adaptable, by knowing their territories intimately, by being willing to use any available advantage, by choosing when to fight and when to negotiate, by understanding that survival sometimes means compromise, other times means stubborn resistance, and these are timeless lessons. In any conflict, in any challenge, knowing your strengths, understanding your terrain, literal or metaphorical, being willing to adapt strategies, that matters more than brute force. The Mongols also learned. After finding limits to their expansion, they adapted. They became more focused on consolidation, on transforming conquests into stable control, on establishing administrative systems that didn't depend on constant military presence. Some Khanates settled, adopted local cultures, transformed from nomadic empire into more conventional states. This transformation process is fascinating. The Mongols, who had conquered as nomads of the steppes, eventually became urban rulers, patrons of art and architecture, administrators of complex societies. They didn't abandon Mongol identity, but adapted it, blended it with cultures they governed. And perhaps that's the deepest legacy, adaptability. Both Mongols and northern peoples showed remarkable capacity to adapt, to learn, to change strategies when necessary. Not by abandoning identity, but by recognizing that survival and success require flexibility. The world has changed much since 1240. Empires have risen and fallen. Technology has transformed war and society. What was remote has become connected. What seemed permanent has changed. But some principles remain: importance of terrain, value of local knowledge, limits of power, necessity of adaptation. The northern forests are still there. Different in some aspects, transformed by centuries of change, but recognizable. The descendants of the Mongols still live on the steppes, in Mongolia, in Kazakhstan, in parts of Russia. The descendants of the Norse still inhabit Scandinavia and lands around the Baltic. And if you dig into the cultures of these regions, in the stories people tell, in the values they hold, you'll find echoes of that encounter from 8 centuries ago. Not obvious, not direct, but present, shaping identities, influencing choices, reminding of times when two of history's most formidable peoples met, and neither completely dominated the other. It's a different kind of legacy. Not of a great battle deciding the fate of nations in one day, but of an encounter shaping gradual development, of established limits defining future frontiers, of learned lessons influencing choices for generations. And perhaps that's more important. Not the dramatic moment, but the lasting effect. Not the decisive battle, but the recognition of complexity, that the world is large and diverse enough for multiple forms of power, multiple paths to survival and success. The steppes taught the Mongols certain lessons. The forests and ice taught the Norse others. And when these worlds met, both learned something new. That greatness comes in multiple forms, that respect can exist without domination, that some limits are to be recognized, not challenged. And 8 centuries later, these lessons still resonate in how we think about power, about war, about limits of empire, about resilience of peoples and cultures. Not in direct lines, not in obvious cause and effect, but in subtle patterns that continue shaping our world. The story of that winter of 1240 may be forgotten by many, but its consequences live on, in the maps we use, in the borders we recognize, in the cultures that flourished or were transformed, in lessons that militaries still study, in principles that diplomats still consider. And perhaps the greatest lesson is this, that history isn't just about winners and losers. It's about encounters, about exchanges, about how different peoples and cultures shape each other mutually, sometimes through conflict, sometimes through trade, always through fundamental human connection that transcends power or politics. The Mongols left a permanent mark on human history. The Norse did too, and when they met in those frozen northern lands, both were changed, both contributed to forming the world that would eventually become ours, not through total conquest or perfect resistance, but through something more subtle, more complex, more human, mutual recognition of limits, respect born from confrontation, and the wisdom to know when to fight and when to accept natural boundaries that geography and culture impose. Reflections on Ice and Empires. And so we arrive at the end of this journey through time, through golden steppes and frozen forests, through an encounter that changed the world in ways few realized. So what have we learned? What does this forgotten story of 1240 tell us about human nature, about power, about limits and possibilities? First, there's something profound about how we understand strength. We tend to think of power in linear terms as if there's a simple hierarchy of who's strongest. But reality is more complex, more interesting. The Mongols were without doubt the most impressive military force of the 13th century. They had defeated practically everyone they faced, and yet, in the northern forests, they encountered something they couldn't easily overcome. It wasn't that the defenders were stronger soldier for soldier. It wasn't that they had superior technology or greater numbers. It was that context mattered, terrain mattered, local knowledge mattered, and the determination of people fighting on their own land, using every available advantage, that mattered. It's a reminder that context is everything. That being invincible in one environment doesn't guarantee success in another. That adaptability can be more valuable than brute strength. Think about how many times in history powerful empires have encountered limits not in stronger forces, but in contexts that denied their advantages. And there's something about resilience too. The northern peoples survived not through decisive military victory, but through stubbornness, through knowledge accumulated over generations, through willingness to use any available means. It wasn't heroic in the traditional sense. It wasn't an epic battle where good triumphs over evil. It was more subtle, more complicated, more real. Sometimes survival doesn't mean winning overwhelmingly. It means simply not losing. It means maintaining your identity, your land, your way of life, even when the odds seem impossible. And there's dignity in that. There's strength in a different kind of victory. The Mongols also teach us something valuable. They built the largest land empire in history through adaptability, through pragmatism, through willingness to learn and incorporate what worked, not through rigidity or blind adherence to tradition. And when they found limits to their expansion, they had the wisdom to recognize it, not to waste resources on conquests that didn't make sense. There's wisdom in knowing your limits, in recognizing that not everything is worth conquering, that not every frontier needs to be pushed. This isn't weakness, it's strategic intelligence. How many leaders, how many empires have fallen because they didn't learn this lesson? What a journey, right? If you enjoyed traveling with us, consider subscribing to the channel for more stories like this. And if you have any reflections, share them in the comments. And there's something about how history is told. This story of the encounter between Mongols and Norse is largely forgotten. It doesn't have the drama of Genghis Khan conquering China. It doesn't have the horror of Eastern European invasions. It doesn't have a single decisive battle that can be dated and commemorated. But it was important nonetheless, because it shaped borders, influenced cultural developments, established precedents, and it reminds us that history isn't just about great dramatic moments. It's about gradual processes, about encounters that don't have clear winners, about how geography and culture intertwine to create complex realities. We live in a different world now. Technology has changed the nature of war, of communication, of power. Borders that geography imposed can be overcome in ways that 13th century peoples never imagined. And yet, some principles remain relevant. Local knowledge still matters, adaptability is still crucial, and there are still places, still peoples, who resist external power not through overwhelming force but through intimate knowledge of their context, through willingness to use any advantage, through particular stubbornness that comes from defending home. Perhaps there's also a lesson about how we see the other. Mongols and Norse were profoundly different. They came from almost opposite worlds, had cultures, values, ways of life that couldn't be more contrasting. And yet in the end, there was a kind of mutual respect. Recognition that the other was formidable in their own way, not friendship, not perfect peace, but recognition of shared humanity, that courage and skill exist in multiple forms, that the world is large enough for different forms of greatness. And that's something we need to remember, isn't it, in our polarized world, where we tend to see everything in terms of us versus them, right versus wrong, winner versus loser. Reality is more nuanced. It always has been. The story of that winter of 1240 doesn't have a satisfyingly simple ending. There's no clear villain defeated, no unequivocal hero triumphing. There are just people on different sides doing their best in impossible circumstances, fighting for their homes, for their peoples, for their ways of life. And both, in a way, achieved what they needed. The Mongols maintained their vast empire, continued dominating the steppes, continued being a force that had to be respected and feared. The Norse and their allies maintained their lands, their identities, their harsh but free lives. It wasn't total victory for anyone. But perhaps total victories are rare, perhaps even undesirable. Perhaps the best outcomes are those where both sides find a way to coexist, to respect borders, to recognize that not every conflict needs absolute resolution. Think about the steppes now, 8 centuries later. The wind still blows through the golden grasses, the sky still extends to infinity, but the empires of horsemen that once dominated these lands are gone, transformed, absorbed by new states, new identities, and the northern forests? They're still there. Older than any empire, more lasting than any conquest. The trees don't care about human borders, about battles, about who governs whom. They simply grow, cycle after cycle, silent witnesses to all human turbulence. There's something comforting in that. In knowing there are things larger than our conflicts, more lasting than our empires. The earth continues, the seasons change, life finds its way. The concerns that seem so urgent in one moment become footnotes in history in another. And yet, each individual life matters. Each warrior who fought in that frozen winter, each merchant who navigated dangerous routes, each family that survived impossible conditions, all were important. Their choices, their suffering, their courage, all contributed to creating the world that eventually became ours. We can't know all their names, we can't tell all their stories, but we can honor them by remembering that history isn't just about kings and generals, about great battles and formal treaties. It's about countless individual lives, each navigating circumstances the best way possible. And perhaps in the end, that's the greatest lesson: empathy. The capacity to look through time, through culture, and recognize shared humanity. To see that people 8 centuries ago in distant lands in completely different circumstances were fundamentally like us. They had fears, hopes, loved their families, wanted to protect their homes. The details change, technology evolves, empires rise and fall. But something remains constant: the fundamental human experience of trying to survive, of protecting what's yours, of finding meaning in a world that often seems chaotic and cruel. So as you sleep tonight, let this story warm your dreams. Not as a tale of war and violence, but as a reminder of human resilience, of history's complexity, of how even the greatest powers have limits, and how ordinary people can survive impossible times through knowledge, adaptability, and stubborn determination. The steppes still sing their ancient song, the forests still keep their secrets, and between these worlds there's a story of encounter, of borders established not by treaties, but by practical reality, of respect born not from love, but from recognition of each other's strength. It's a complex story, nuanced, without perfect heroes or absolute villains, just people making difficult choices in difficult times. And in a way, isn't that what every story really is? Close your eyes now. Breathe deeply. Imagine the silence of snowy forest, the vastness of steppe under starry sky. Imagine the world 8 centuries ago, so different and yet so similar to ours. And let the weight of those centuries, of those stories, of those countless lives cradle you into peaceful sleep, because in the end, we're all just passengers through time. Our concerns, our conflicts, our empires will all eventually become stories for someone to tell. But the earth remains, the sky remains, and the human capacity to adapt, survive, and find beauty, even in difficult times, that remains too. Good night. Rest well. And thank you for traveling with me through this fascinating story of when two worlds met and both were changed forever.